The orphan Baruch and his trials. A year after Baruch's bar mitzvah, his mother became seriously ill with a fever, and several months later died. Soon after this, Shner Zalman also became ill, and within 6 months he too passed away. Baruch was now doubly orphaned. The death of both his parents had a shattering effect upon him. The pain and sorrow of the 14-year-old lad cut through him very deeply. Whether it was because he was bound up with them in affection, particularly with his father, or whether it was simply because he suddenly felt so lonely, he walked about as if in a world of desolation. During the period of mourning, Baruch, as the only son left to say Kaddish, used to go to the Beis HaMedrash and lead the prayers. He also used to learn Mishnayos for the souls of his departed parents. With all this, however, he could not still his great pain. It was obvious to all that young Baruch was losing health, and they saw the effect his misfortune had upon his spirit. In Vitebsk, Baruch had an Aunt Freda, whose husband was called Kaddish. They took Baruch and his sister Dvoraleah to live with them, and did their best to be kind and friendly to them. Dvoraleah was more or less comforted, but Baruch could find no peace of mind, even in the home of his kind relatives. One day Baruch informed his uncle, aunt, and his sister that he had decided to leave Vitebsk. "I shall go some place of Torah study," he declared. "Where will you get to? You are too young to wander about," they tried to plead with him. "Better stay with us. You will be short of nothing." However, all their talk availed them nothing. Young Baruch had already decided what he intended to do and would not allow anyone to change his mind. A few days passed, and Baruch left Vitebsk without leaving any trace behind him. Meanwhile, the tragic news of the death of Shner Zalman and his wife reached Rabbi Moshe, who, as we know, had settled in Minsk, where he carried on his business with great success. He at once sent a special messenger to Vitebsk to bring his 2 orphan grandchildren to live with him, and in his home they would literally have everything they wished for. When this messenger arrived in Vitebsk, Baruch had already left the town, and no one knew which direction he had taken. The messenger could not take Dvoraleah either, for her uncle and aunt were childless and did not want to let her go, and so she stayed with them until she married. Meanwhile, Baruch wandered about the towns and townlets around Vitebsk, and could find no permanent place of rest. For 3 years he wandered thus. He spent some time in Dobromizl, Kalisk, and other townlets. Wherever he came, he settled down in the Beis HaMedrash to study, but absolutely refused to accept support either from public or private sources. As was then the custom, anyone who studied in the Beis HaMedrash was invited to have a day's meal at the home of one or another of the local Jews, and if the student did not wish to sleep in the Beis HaMedrash, a room was found for him in a private house. Baruch, however, was not interested in all these arrangements. How then could he live? He solved the problem by becoming a woodcutter and water carrier, or else he assisted the stallholders on market days. Baruch was not ashamed to do any kind of honest work. Nothing was beneath him, nor too hard. He followed the view of the sages: better to skin a carcass in the marketplace than to accept alms. But many people failed to understand Baruch, and few bothered to discover the motives of the young lad. Many put him down as eccentric and dismissed him from their minds with a shrug of the shoulder and a gesture of the hand, while others paid him not even that attention and took no notice of him whatsoever. Baruch was not at all concerned about the matter. Let people think of him what they would, or not at all, as long as they left him in peace to carry on in his own sweet way. And so nobody disturbed him in the slightest degree wherever he went, and thus he wandered forth to another townlet, where he again took up his own particular way of life, studying day and night in the Beis HaMedrash, and earning his modest living by means of the hardest task he could obtain, so long as it paid for his humble needs. After Baruch had wandered through a whole range of townlets, he eventually arrived at Liozna. There he soon settled down to study in the large Beis HaMedrash. Baruch had saved a little money from the various arduous jobs which he had done in the townlets where he had been. However small had been his earnings, his daily needs were always smaller. A small piece of dry bread, something with the bread, and Baruch was satisfied. Shoes, clothing, these were matters of little importance to him. That is why he managed to bring up to him to Liozna a small nest egg which would keep him supplied with his humble requirements for some time. Thus was Baruch able to settle down to his studies in the Beis HaMedrash undisturbed and with great zeal. This was truly a happy period for this 17-year-old youth. No worries about making a living, and free to study by day and by night. When a youth such as Baruch, an unknown stranger, comes along and settles down so assiduously to study in the Beis HaMedrash, demanding nothing from anybody, even to the value of a cent, it was bound to attract attention. Ezra, the Shamash of the Beis HaMedrash, was the first to take notice of the young student. He asked Baruch if he was sure he wouldn't like someone to supply him with meals and other necessities. Baruch declared that he neither desired nor needed help from anyone. He had all he required. Baruch, having made the Beis HaMedrash his home, often helped the Shamash in his various tasks. He helped him to sweep the Beis HaMedrash, he brought water from the basin, and carried out the water in which the worshippers had washed their hands. He helped to light the lamps and candles before Shabbos and on other days of the week. In fact, he almost became Ezra's assistant. Although the Shamash wanted to recompense him for his work, Baruch refused any kind of payment, saying he wanted to help as a favor, and anyway, he didn't need any reward. When he would need anything from his physical well-being, he could always go out and work, but at the moment he was short of nothing. Ezra shrugged his shoulders. He had never met anyone like Baruch before. In great admiration, he spoke about him to Eliezer Zundel, the Gabbai of the Beis HaMedrash. The other regular worshippers at the Beis HaMedrash had also heard of Baruch and became interested in the young lad who studied so keenly at the Beis HaMedrash. "Who is he? Where does he come from?" asked Eliezer Zundel, the Gabbai. The Shamash shrugged his shoulders. He really didn't know. "I just couldn't get the information out of him," said Ezra. "It seems he doesn't want to tell." The Gabbai himself tried to elicit information from Baruch in a friendly chat. He also offered to look after him. Baruch, however, showed no wish to talk of his family and relatives, where he had come from, and why he had chosen to come to Liajna. He declined the Gabbai's help. The Gabbai saw that he wasn't getting anywhere with Baruch, who seemed very stubborn. He decided that Baruch must be a bit queer, and going to the Shamash, said, "I can do nothing with him. You try again. We must find out something about him. We can't just let him go hungry." So Ezra, encouraged, again tried to press Baruch for some personal information. The Shamash also declined any longer to accept Baruch's refusals of his invitations and insisted that he come home with him to eat. "It's not right for anyone to endorse such a mode of living," Ezra urged Baruch, but the latter remained adamant. When Baruch saw that he would not be able to get out of Ezra's clutches, he left the Beis HaMedrash and went to the smaller one on the outskirts of town. There no one bothered him. He could carry on as he wished. Baruch saw, though, that the little money he had brought with him to Liajna, which had been keeping his body and soul together, was dwindling slowly but surely. Soon he would not have enough even to buy bread. So he started to be very careful and sparing even with his ration of dry bread. He began to look out for new possibilities of earning something. He went into the town to find some work. He thought of becoming a porter, but saw that Liajna had more than enough porters already, and they were all married men. "I wouldn't want to take their living away from them," Baruch said to himself, and looked for something else. He wanted to become a water carrier, but discovered that the majority of people in Liajna were too poor to afford the luxury of engaging a water carrier. They all went to the wells and river and carried the water to their homes themselves. As for the small minority of wealthier inhabitants, they already had the regular water carriers, so Baruch would not care to take away their custom, heaven forbid. That, in his view, would have been unjust. Baruch would have become a woodcutter, but here again there were poor people enough ready to hire themselves out as choppers of wood, or to do similar heavy work. Baruch was determined not to compete with any of these people, who needed all they could earn to feed themselves and their dependents. He began to feel really low-spirited, and his heart was heavily troubled. Troubled for all the poor souls he saw struggling for a bare existence. He began to reproach himself for not having been more careful to make his money stretch out for a longer period, and made up his mind that with the remaining amount of money, small though it was, he would indeed be very careful and eat even less than before. He almost reached hunger level, but did not slacken in his studies. If anything, he studied more intensively than before. The worshippers in the small Beis HaMedrash were all absolute paupers. They all had their own worries and took little notice of the young student. No one troubled to wonder how he lived. His pale, pinched face made it obvious that Baruch was suffering hunger, but to the people who comprised the small congregation of this Beis HaMidrash it was nothing new. They were accustomed to seeing such half-starved countenances. This Beis HaMidrash was too poor to employ a shamish, but there was an old man who volunteered to carry out the duties of a shamish in an honorary capacity, and occasionally a worshipper would slip him a coin into his hand, and so he managed to live. This old man saw what zeal Baruch studied in the Beis HaMidrash, and he also could not help seeing that he hadn't enough to eat. It troubled him that he could give Baruch no help, not knowing that it would have been refused, even if offered. In general, he had little to do with Baruch. He felt himself to be an ignorant old man, and how would he dare to approach this brilliant young student? So the winter passed and spring came. As Baruch lived on the outskirts of the town, he felt very near to God's creation, which he loved so dearly. He now began taking long walks in the country. The sun shone, the sky was blue, and the earth was covered with a green mantle. The trees began to bloom, and the woods filled with the air of fragrance. The birds sang, and the bees hummed. It was just the time when Baruch loved to stretch out on the meadow grass under a tree and dream his dreams. In the fresh air and in the greater concentration of his studies, he would forget his worries and his hunger.